Our gospel reading for this Sunday comes from the 10th chapter of the Gospel of John on this Good Shepherd Sunday. In this text, you will hear Jesus declaring himself to be the Good Shepherd. For those who are listening to him or those who are familiar with the Hebrew Scriptures, he is hearkening back to the 34th chapter of the prophet Ezekiel, who, as Jesus does, compares the good shepherding of God to the imperfect and often self-serving shepherding of humans. So let's listen for God's gracious word to us today from John chapter 10, verses 11 through 18. Jesus said to them, "I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand, who is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and runs away. And the wolf snatches them and scatters them. The hired hand runs away because a hired hand does not care for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. And I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that do not belong to this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock, one shepherd. For this reason, the Father loves me, because I lay down my life in order to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have power to lay it down, and I have power to take it up again. I have received this command from my Father." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Whenever I read these shepherd texts in the Bible lately, I can't help but think of my German shepherd dog, Blue. Mark my words, Blue, while he is a German shepherd and is a very good dog, is not at all similar to an actual shepherd. His only similarity to Jesus is that he loves me. I'm not sure what Blue would do if he ever saw a real live sheep. He's terrified of small children, tries to hide behind me if little kids approach to pet him. So I expect he wouldn't like sheep either. Although the other night I heard Bob talking to Blue. Here's an elephant. Here's a sheep. Here's a moo cow. But they were sharing a bowl of animal cookies. Still, I think of sheep and shepherds and dogs who, like Blue, were bred to be working sheepdogs. One preacher whose work I often read wrote about his German shepherd, Sprocket. Sprocket was with us, for us, watching us, protecting us, he wrote. Every person who stood up and moved to a different room, every squirrel that passed by the glass door, every creak in the building, he investigated. He said, "I don't think there's a substitute for the feeling of security that comes from knowing you're the object of someone's constant care and concern. If he couldn't protect me from all harm, it would not have been for lack of trying." That provision of safety, protection, love is the very image of a good shepherd. And that is what Jesus gives to the flock, to us. Jesus knew when he described himself as the good shepherd for those listening that day that they would call to mind the bad shepherds described in Ezekiel 34. Bad shepherds who cared only for themselves. "You don't strengthen the weak, heal the sick, bind up the injured, bring back the strays, or seek out the lost," the prophet Ezekiel says to those bad shepherds of Israel. "But instead you use force to rule them with injustice." There are good shepherds and there are hirelings. We don't have to be experts on sheep and sheepdogs and shepherding to grasp the difference. We can tell when someone does not have our best interests at heart. We don't have to be sheep to know the anxiety that's felt when the hired hand abandons us, when the hired hand cares more for himself and his narcissistic fantasies. We experience what it's like to be a sheep, frightened, vulnerable, helpless. There are sheepdogs and there are wolves, and we don't have to be a sheep to understand the terror when a snarling wolf approaches. Without a shepherd or sheepdog, the flock is exposed and defenseless. More than once this past year, the people of our country have learned what happens when those employed to serve like a shepherd, guarding and defending, do the opposite and actually kill those that they're called to protect. More than once this past year, we who are white have at last begun to understand that racism prowls our streets like a merciless wolf, consuming lives, ravaging relationships. It's traumatic. It's toxic. The fear and trauma soak all the way to our bones. We look with suspicion on others. We freeze or flight or fawn or flee. We fear we will die or be killed. It is then that we need to listen to the voice of our good shepherd. In other scriptures, Jesus reminds us that sheep know their shepherd. They know his voice and they follow him. The same is true of a sheepdog who listens to the shepherd and follows his command. It's not so much a hierarchy as a chain of command, shepherd to sheepdog to sheep. You might say that ministers and priests are like the sheepdogs in this story, because the sheepdog does not serve the sheep, but obeys the shepherd. The shepherd trains the sheepdog to do his bidding, caring for his flock, guiding and leading and herding the sheep, and occasionally nipping at their heels. There's a great story about a shepherd herding his large flock across the road when an expensive sports car came speeding up and came to a screeching halt. A young, well-dressed man stepped out of the car and waiting for the sheep to cross. And the guy's, checking his phone and he's fiddling with his expensive sunglasses, and finally calls out to the shepherd, "Hey, buddy, if I can tell you exactly how many sheep you have, will you give one of them to me?" Amused, the shepherd simply nodded. So the guy starts tapping at his cell phone, pulls out a laptop, looks up some satellite imagery and says, 1,347. Shepherd nodded again, saying nothing. The young man starts walking through the flock to select his sheep, and when he's done that and gotten back in the car, the shepherd quietly said, "If I can name your profession, will you return the animal to me?" The young man said, "Sure." The shepherd said, "You're a consultant." The young man was astonished. "How did you know?" The shepherd said, "Well, you came without invitation, told me something I already knew, and charged me for it, all the while knowing nothing about my business. Now, can I have my dog back?" There are lots of voices out there. Lots of people who claim to be experts. There are lots of voices who want to guide us in the way they think we should go. There are lots of people who seem to think they know a lot. But there's only one shepherd. When actual sheep are scared, they run back to the flock. They freeze in terror, they mill around and bump into each other, and sometimes in their panic, they will blindly run off of a steep cliff. That's why sheep need a shepherd. When humans are anxious, they often turn on each other. relieving their anxiety by attacking someone else in the flock, or they separate from the flock and put themselves in vulnerable spaces. That's why we need a shepherd. And friends, listen to Jesus. He says we are not his only sheep. We who are part of this congregation or of any church, we who are flocked here together are not his only sheep. Sometimes the shepherd will send the sheepdog out to the fields to round up those who have not yet come into the fold. These other sheep will hear the shepherd's voice. They will come and join the flock, Jesus says, and there will be one flock, one shepherd. That flock is not and cannot be contained in one building or even one denomination. Our shepherd brings us together into one flock, whatever the opinions of individual sheep might be. Those who are part of the flock know what it is like to feel his presence, his care, his concern. We know that he will lead us even through the valley of the shadow of death, and we need not fear. As the flock, as we grow in faith and discipleship, we learn more and more to listen for his voice, to go where he leads, to do what he asks, to stay where he puts us. Our shepherd cares for us, restoring our souls. We need not worry, for he leads us to green pastures and still waters. He leads us in paths of goodness for his name's sake. And our shepherd gave his very life for us, freely, willingly. He laid down his life and took it back up again. He came so that we might have life and have it abundantly. Thanks be to God that Jesus is our good shepherd as we grow in faith as his people and the sheep of his pasture. Thanks be to God. Amen.